Great. Okay, so with that said, welcome to the Cardea user group. We are diving in today to talk about app data collection and identity verification of individuals. And before we jump into the details, we need to talk about the Linux Foundation Antitrust policy, which you can find on their website, which we are certainly governed by, and then also our Cardea Code of Conduct, which is in summary, to be nice, that everybody is welcome to have a voice here. If you have any concerns with either of those things, you can reach out to myself or Ken as co-chairs of this committee, and we would be happy to do something. If there's an issue with one of us, you can reach out to the other. But everybody is welcome, and everybody should have a voice at this committee, so please don't be shy. And with that said, I'm going to turn this over to have Mike from ID Ramp get us started. He is the CEO and has been very involved in this space around app data collection and identity verification. So I'm excited to present him to this committee, and welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I'll preface this by saying everything that I'm presenting here are not things that I'm dictating as this is the way the world must work. This is a conversation that we all need to have, and we have to start now. I know that many of the faces in the room, we've been down this road a lot. One thing that I have done in my professional career, which spans many years, too many years, is understand identity. So we understand very well how identities are used within the enterprise, within the businesses and services that we've worked with over the number of years I've been doing this. And it's never black and white, right? It's never easy. And so this is not going to be easy either. But I prepared a few slides just because I really didn't know, when we were thinking about this, Akila came in and said, "Hey, would you be interested in talking?" And at first I'm terrified. I'm like, I don't know. What am I going to say? Well, I know nothing about this, but we have to start this conversation. And I just want to get all these topics out in front of the really smart minds here in this room. And let's have some dialogue. Let's talk about the best ways. What do we need to do versus what do we want to do? And all that stuff. So if I can figure out how to share,
yes,
I'll share these slides.
You should be able to share.
All right, I will share this, and you tell me if you can see it. It does weird things when I go to view mode. So I'll try to put this in like a full screen mode.
There
is
you
that
go.
Showing just a splash? Okay.
Excellent.
All right, so there it is. I'm just kidding. All right, so I want everybody to give me credit for the nice logo that I put in there, though, because I worked really hard on that. The rest of it's black and white, which my presentations normally are. So a quick overview, we do want to try and talk about identity verification and binding. What's the scope of that? Identity data collection. How do we do that? Why should we do that? Do we need to do that, right? Very healthy conversation around that, I'm sure. The best practices, participation is something that I feel is going to be the make or break, right? Depending on how good of a job we do in making the community accessible to existing processes, existing businesses, existing organizations, that's going to dictate the success or failure. And those are very rich, right? We're talking about a lot of really complicated things here, really well established existing ecosystems that we're trying to innovate with some new technology. So open discussion, that should apply throughout the whole presentation. Please don't let me just drone on, stop and ask questions, and let's have some discussion. I'll be prompting some questions throughout as well. If there's anything else that people want to talk about, feel free to bring that up as well. These are just the things that bounced out of my head when we were looking at this topic. So I'm going to start with verification. Verification seems unnatural, and I'm sure we're all thinking about this, that some of those methods are going to include some type of physical document capture and data collection. And so all of these things kind of play off one another. I think we're going to see naturally the app is going to evolve to include physical document and data capture, which is certainly one part of identity verification, right? It's verifying that we have these physical documents. There's another very rich conversation that needs to happen around the back end processes. What do we do once we verify we're looking at a legitimate document? And then there's the whole biometric integration, which is another factor, if you will, or another part of this process. So it doesn't do any good to bind a physical document and say this passport or driver's license or whatever it is that we're using as our source document. It doesn't do any good to validate that unless we can also put some unique signature on that. And what is that? Is that biometrics? Is there something else we can do? Really like to discuss that and see what others think as viable options in that space. So in my mind right now, as I'm thinking through it, it's okay, we probably need to do some kind of a physical document capture. We need to do all that we can programmatically behind the scenes to make sure that that document is legitimate and valid. And once we do that, we need some form of integration to key that or tie it to the individual that's looking at the or that's actually holding the agent, you know, the method or the wallet, if you will, that we're using. So, so any questions on that before I skip? Go.
I have a question. I think that it's interesting to consider. There's biometric binding that can be between a document and a person. There's also biometric binding between, for instance, a piece of software that holds a credential and a person. And so those are kind of two flavors of the same issue, but have perhaps different mechanisms for making that occur. Is that
correct? Yeah,
that's thinking, or is that different?
I think it's a great conversation, Ken. I mean, I think that's the same. That's the same thing I was kind of alluding to. We have to find that unique signature, and what are those unique signatures? What is that we need to be examining? It's really our job here. We have to decide what that is, what's it look like, and how's it going to be used. So, so yeah, that's a great comment, and we should definitely talk through that. Because it's going to be fundamental, right? It's one of the first things we have to do, and it has to be done right. So really anxious to see what we have for thoughts around that already, and some of the things that are in the app already, and what things we need to look to include and where to get those, right? It's easy to put a bullet on a slide that says biometric integration, but there's about 1 billion organizations that do that, right? And so how do we integrate? And none of them, to my knowledge, are open source or open standard, but but maybe there's a lot of special sauce in those algorithms, and how do we best include that into this project? So any thoughts on that?
I think your description is fairly accurate from what I've seen, that there are a lot of proprietary solutions. There's fewer or very limited open source methodologies for doing that. And then, but I think your discussion of binding that to a particular document is an interesting aspect as well. So I think you've identified some really interesting topics.
Right. Yeah. And the next thing that I planned to discuss is now what, right? So now we have this, how do we bind that identity? How do we define the portability of that? So once we have that binding, and also, back to the verification, that implies this is a global scale, right? So it's not as simple as looking at a particular regional issued driver's license or some other, state issued document. This is something we have to be able to verify on a global scale and make portable, which I'll discuss in a minute. But
well, and on the
go ahead, Heather.
Biometrics too, Bill over at Lorica, this is something he's been thinking about as well. So he may have some ideas to offer as we go through the conversation.
Yeah, awesome. And again, at any time, this is a discussion. These are the things that are bouncing around inside my head. So maybe we've covered this ground, maybe we still need to, but let's just all throw our thoughts in here to see if we're going the right direction. To me, once we get through a verification piece, right, let's assume we can do all the things on that previous slide, and we are going to do the verification. We liveness, we do voice imprint, whatever it is. We have all this stuff baked into this magical app. And I know that all of the KYC stuff is done, right? So I know that Ken's holding this app and it's Ken. Then how do we make that stuff portable? Where do we go with that? So now we have this thing. What's our method? Well, clearly, I think, my thinking is I would love to see those in verifiable credentials, right, that make them portable so that other systems can more easily access that bound identity without having to go through a lot of that real-time checking. It makes it more open to others to come in and contribute technology. But is that the only way? Is there another way we need to be thinking about portability? And that leads in a little bit to some of the data collection stuff, which is the next couple of slides that we'll talk about. What do we do with that? So is it okay that we say, okay, now we know Ken's Ken, so we're going to take and we're going to represent Ken somehow through some credential? Who's issuing that, right? Is that Ken's, right? Is he responsible for that? And any updates or changes to that? What's that process look like, right? So that I need a lot of help trying to figure out what that's going to look like. It's easy to say, oh, we're just going to take it and make a credential, but there's a lot of responsibility and management and upkeep that has to go into that if that's going to be the thing that we use for external applications to interface and be able to participate in the community that we're building. Does that make sense?
Well, and it really boils down to trust at the end of the day with that, right? Because where other people are then going to take your credential and do something with it because you've said Ken is Ken, and we can proceed down whatever the next step is. So yeah. The real question is, as you've said, how do you maintain that over time? And then how do you verify that you've hit a certain level of trust? What's an acceptable level of trust to accept your credential? If you issue, I think this is a really interesting one that I've been struggling with, and is what's the minimum bar that I would accept for, the proverbial, like this system or whatever system needs to accept to know that you verified it. Does it include biometrics? Does it include, XYZ other verifications? And so once you issue the identity verification credential, they're not all created equal. And so how do you measure, this one went to this level and this one only went to this level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And that's a conversation on some of the Nist stuff that's been published, right? I know we need to actually absolutely bake that in. And it's a governance question, right? We have to have somewhere defined what is acceptable and what's not. And then you're right. And the second part of this, the access methods, and how we're going to make this information available. We have to define a set of standards for others that are participating to understand those trust levels and those assurance levels, right? And I think that's all greenfield, and it's things that we have to get through and discuss. I wish I had a lot more answers there. I just know there's some really tough questions and things that we need to get through. But that's why this community is here. All right, so great stuff there. Let's talk a little bit about collection. This one is near and dear to my heart because for the past 20 years, all I've been trying to do is break silos, right? That's going to be my parting shot is breaker of silos. I think that's what we're trying to break down. So now, we have this facing us again. What do we do when all this identity data has been identified and we've issued a credential or whatever it is, and we say this is the thing you can take out and it's trustable and people can access this? That whole process, does that have to be? Is there a reason that information needs to be centrally collected? I want to say no so badly. I want to say nope, just never going to do it. And we just need to break it all up, issue those into credentials. They're held on the wallet. The user is under control of those, and that's it, full stop. But is that the case? Is there a reason we need to consider holding this stuff in a system where it can be accessed by others? Is it a regulatory thing? Is it? I don't know the answer to that, and I would love to hear others' thoughts on what that is. Are we just all violently against any kind of data repository, or does it need to exist? And if it does need to exist, how do we do it safely, securely, and what type of governance is that going to take, right? So, anybody have any thoughts on that? I'm really curious on this one. I didn't have a lot of really good thoughts on this. I just wanted to really see what others were thinking.
I think there's a spectrum of data on this one. This one's kind of fun because obviously the issuer has some kind of a database of their own in order to issue the credential, or they may not keep a database at all. They just verify the data and issue and then walk away. It makes it really hard to do revocation if you never keep track of what you issued. So
Yeah.
that's one aspect of it. The where the data is held after it's issued is another topic for a spectrum. The government of BC for business credentials has put them in a big centrally publicly available repository. For private individuals, privacy preservation kind of dictates a more decentralized approach or favors that approach. But there are cases where you have to see where on the spectrum things should exist. For verifiers, how long are they allowed to keep the data that they've seen? So if you look at the different issuer, verifier, and holders, who has rights to see the data? How long can they keep it? Do they have the right to be forgotten? So there's some compliance issues with GDPR and then CCPA, other regulations that might offer some guidance on data handling. In healthcare, there's some particular challenges as well. Keela, you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, I was going to pipe in on that. So in the US, there are some healthcare regulations that say, first of all, that you would have to be able to respond to an audit. And that may come in multiple ways. So it could be that in this case, a patient is requesting the audit for everywhere their data went. And the only way you might know that is by keeping some information on who you sent it to and where it went. And there's even some time parameters on that. And so in the US healthcare law, you have to maintain records for a minimum of 6 years. So some of that gets dictated. Again, I think the nuances of exactly what you have to keep and exactly how much to be able to hit that bar could be discussed, but there's definitely some nuances there. And you also have to be able to know that you got the identity and you did the patient match. And under what pretenses did you make that match? Of course, the data isn't static for the person or their health record. And so that evolves and might change over time, and you might need to re-reconcile. And if you didn't keep it, that could certainly be challenging.
Yeah, and how does that get defined, right? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud now that, as that stuff evolves and changes, who's, where does that happen and how do those things go to? If the healthcare system has to reissue something because of change to data, how do we automatically rematch and make sure that we're associating that with the same bound identity that we've determined in our first couple steps? So, when I put this slide down here and I started thinking about it, this is why I kind of prefaced it with, we need a good conversation, because there's nothing easy, right? These are all moving parts. And so is it going to be necessary that there is some master, repository? I hate to think that there may be, but maybe there is. And we need to figure that out and discuss how we do that. Does there need to be a one, identity is a horrible word, one identifier, right, that we are continually referencing back when those changes are made? So there's just a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. I also think about the method of, if we determine that does need to happen, right, then what's our method of access? How are we going to govern that? How are we going to control how those updates get made? Again, real easy to say, oh, it's up to the user. The user's going to hold it all, but users aren't really good at doing stuff. So, there's just that whole thing that we have to try to consider and figure out how far we actually need to move the needle here, and what's an acceptable starting point to get some immediate traction.
And one more point that I think is important to make is it's really great that we're going to have this on-ramp that will require really robust patient identity verification and, person identity verification. But the reality of the issue is that when that person went to get their vaccine, at least in the US, there's a pretty low validation and data entry happening. So yeah. You've set the bar really high on one side, and then you're trying to match it on the other side to something that has a way lower bar. And that's also bridging that gap and sort of trying to get those things connected is going to be pretty tricky, I think.
Yeah, I mean, monumental task. You're right. You don't need anything. You just walk down to the corner and get a
Tell 'em
shot
my name
and a
is.
piece of paper. So how do we bind that very loose? Is it okay to make a self-attestation of that? Can we say, here's my attest, and is that then verifiable, right? I mean, so there's so many questions. And if it's not, then what's the process to access healthcare? What's the process that we as individuals can say, hey, healthcare provider, I really need this thing. And that implies then retrofitting their existing systems, which I mentioned at the outset. Those things have been around forever, and they're very rigid and they're very hardened. And there's not an easy way to just open a side door, and say, well, here, we're just going to start this new thing. So all of that has to be considered as well. What I'm really looking for here, I think, is, I think we need to strongly challenge ourselves to build the cookbook, right? To build this thing and say, here are the key data points that we're going to need. Here are the key interaction points we're going to need, and try to start as simply as possible with a very easy to adopt, easy to understand mission statement, and then we evolve it over time as it gains traction and picks up speed. So that's where it makes sense for me to start. But all of these things that we're discussing now have to happen, and these are conversations we have to have. So yeah, great so far.
Mike, one other comment on storage. Some people have recognized that users aren't particularly adept at maintaining their own wallets.
Right.
So the custodial wallet approach is another one that's kind of a hybrid between completely decentralized, where it lives maybe in a user's phone, versus the custodial wallet, where the kind of the backup and restore and the kind of the IT management part of taking care of a wallet can be done on your behalf. And that could be done either benevolently by an organization that hosts that for free to the end user, or it could be a service that is provided that consumers recognize the value and are willing to pay for.
Yeah, and a couple things in there. So even if an organization provides it out of generosity, it's still an organization, it's still one entity. So there's so much there to unpack. And
so then they have a
completely
database.
Agree. Exactly.
Repository,
right.
yes.
Exactly. So, but if you say, well, we don't want to do that, and that holds true for the steward, which I think, Ken, you're spot on, right? I would love to think that we just blow the doors off this, everything's decentralized, but we got a ways to go there. And I think we all realize we have a way to go there. And that stewardship is going to be a thing. There's going to be a place for that. I don't like it. I don't have to like it to appreciate its need in the market. And that's the same thing with the data collection I was talking about originally. Remember that we think about biometrics as I know them and the systems that do that today. It's massive amounts of information that's being collected, and all that information exists somewhere. Now, ideal state, we use the information, we do the verification, we issue a credential, we stick it in the wallet, and the user has total control over that. Us as humans control that. Great, but we can't. So now what? What are the policies? What are the things that are going to have to be defined? And if that information that is being stored either by a biometric service provider or by a provider of some services that's doing that initial data binding or identity binding based on those physical documents or whatever that process is, where are they storing that data? And if it needs to be stored, then how is it accessed? And that has to be open as well. We can't, if we say, okay, we got 3 different systems and they're all going to store these little bits and pieces, and we need all of them to talk together, and we don't invent a more creative or a more forward-thinking way of doing that, then we're stepping back to 1998 SAML 1.0, and we're in the old school federation, and we all are going to be together complaining about that in another 20 years. So it's imperative that we think about, as all these different places that exist, that we're going to have to store data to get to our end of binding and identity to be used throughout this project and others. what happens to that data footprint? Is if it needs to be accessible, what's our method? Do we stuff that in some other type, fabric-based system or something, and we define a governance around who can access it, and or is it all through credentials, and those credentials get stored only on the user device, and then the consequences of that? So I mean, it's a very rich topic, and I think we have a lot of work to do to sort it out. Which is, again, to my point, we need to try and find the least friction-filled road to start and just make some rules and go.
Mike, do you know, I'm just aware of a bunch of companies that I think they're selling that service, right? So you have like Okta and the other one, Ping Identity. That's what they're selling basically, right? Is that they'll be the verifier and then issuer. And so if you needed to reissue, you could go back to them because you're paying for that service. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep. And ID.me, I think, is probably there or getting there. They're focused more on the street, on the commercial or on the user side. Ping and Okta are focused mostly on the enterprise space, doing that for the enterprise. But you're exactly right, and I have problems with all of that. I understand, I respect everything that they're doing, but at the end of the day, you've still got one organization or multiple organizations doing the same thing, and now you're back to old school federation because they're not doing it the same way, right? So interoperability, as again, like I say, I see a lot of familiar faces on this call. We've been talking about this for forever, but interoperability is an incredibly hard thing to do. It's much easier and it's much faster, and you can get to the money faster if you just say, we're going to go this way and it's going to be vertical and it's going to be ours. That code's a lot easier to write than trying to make it interoperable. So that's what I see in the industry, that the organizations that are doing that, the promise of it is quick and easy, and you pay by the drink. But the long term of that, I mean, you're reducing the friction today, but you're adding a lot of cost and complexity down the road because you have this static system you have to interface with.
And Mike, this is Bill Hinn. I just also want to comment. I think your strategy of building it simple, making it accessible to everybody, and the compatibility issue across multiple disparate systems is the issue. But it requires a governance, from the issuer, as well as a governance from the holder. He needs to be bought into that. So I think it is a major issue, but a lot of our clients don't want the data collected by a third party, like one of those companies. They want to own the information, and it gets back to a liability issue. I mean, we're all talking, of how we should change the industry, but it gets back to the policies set out by governments as well as policies from customers. What are their strategies on data collection? And a lot of them are written into the master service contracts. So it is a challenge issue, and we're trying to stay away from collecting any of the data. We're holding it for a short period, and then it's gone. So that's the whole strategy that we're looking at and trying to understand that.
Yeah, spot on, Bill, and that's good. I mean, great comments. You're exactly right. We see that in our business as well, right? The companies that are engaging with a biometric service provider, for example, are incredibly concerned about where that data is going. And we come in and we say, well, that's great. We'll just put it in this credential, and this credential protected. We can explain all of that stuff, and everything's going, yeah, great. But all of the information used to derive that credential, where's that? Who's
Correct.
Protecting that, and how do we, and so that is the slippery slope, right? And there's 3 bullets on this slide that could entail months of conversation and and decisions. And our goal, I mean, we have to have the goal of saying we're going to make it as simple and easy as possible, but we have to also understand that all these questions are going to come up, and they're all incredibly valid. So we always like to look at it and say, if you're going to use an outside service like it, we got to give whoever the ultimate consumer of that has to have the option. They have to have the option of controlling what happens with that data after that initial collection and binding process.
Yeah, that's correct. And if they're not talking about it, then they're unaware of it. And then that brings up liability issues. So
Right.
that's the major issue that I always bring up with our clients is if you're not talking about it right now, then you better start.
Yeah. Yep. The fact that you don't know doesn't mean it's not going to get you in trouble. That's exactly
Yep.
right.
Or you
Yeah,
have
good.
the colonial pipeline hackers coming. So
Yep. Great. Well, that's yeah. So those are my thoughts, comments. I mean, certainly those were great additions. I hope, Keely, I hope you're not looking for some kind of a blueprint that's solving all the problems, because all I'm doing is just identifying them.
No, but I think this is our first meeting where the majority of our notes have question marks at the end of them.
Yeah. Yep.
Instead of discussing the concrete things, I think this is a lot to consider.
Mike, I had a
For
couple
sure.
of comments. Just that one is that you're dealing with kind of three different types of systems to start with, right? One of them is that you're dealing with good old-fashioned paper or plastic credentials, right? You're dealing with current existing systems that have identity with them. They're centralized identities that are clustered around a particular organization, right? And then now you have the new verifiable decentralized identity. You're trying to bridge a gap between a paper, plastic, your current ID with a particular website or an organization, and now a new decentralized identity base. So you're trying to bridge across three different types of systems. Would you agree or disagree with that assessment? Or is it something different than that? Is it more than that?
I do. We didn't even collaborate ahead of this, but watch this next slide. Easy to bridge. So I mean, it's like you're inside my head. That is the success or failure, as I mentioned early on, is going to be our ability to do just that, Ken. I mean, in my opinion, and Bill just made some great comments there, kind of reiterated that as well. If we are not building something here that is extensible by existing processes and systems today, then we're drawing dead. I mean, we literally have to be able to show up and say, okay, it's this new thing, and this new thing has a lot of promise for whatever it is, whatever that mission statement is, and here's how you get there, right? If we can't give them a blueprint and say, here's where you are, we understand where you are is complex and it's not always pretty, but here's the bridge, here's how you can get there, and that's and provide them the documentation and the examples and everything that we need. And that is beyond saying, okay, we've developed this new thing and it's going to hold all this information in this magical thing called a credential, and we drop the mic and walk off, we're in trouble, right? We have to say, okay, and here's how you consume this credential within your existing apps. You've got an app and it knows how to make some claim against something via an API or via maybe some federation protocol like an OAuth message or OIDC or something like that. Then then here's your bridge. Here's how you do that, right? Here's the block of code you can use. We need to be that explicit to really make sure that we're not speaking a foreign language and risking lack of adoption or lack of understanding because the gap seems too big, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the education aspect is a really big one, especially as you start to put it in the hands of anybody with a phone. To understand that I keep joking. My background is in healthcare, right? And I spend my entire life trying to protect the healthcare data because it is centralized and it is vulnerable in those ways, and as it needs to be in some cases. But then you have people who go and post their vaccine card on Facebook. And you're like, what are you doing, guys?
Yeah.
Data privacy matters, but they don't understand why, and that shouldn't have been posted, and that it does contain information that's sort of asking to be hacked, and or undermine their identity. So that education that has to happen en masse, right? We're sitting, in a sort of a virtual room here full of geeks that love this topic, but we have to educate everybody. They have to care, or they have to have systems put in place to sort of force it, even if they don't care.
Right. And Keela, I think interestingly enough that I shouldn't speak for the industry. A year ago, 2 years ago, right, I had this very cynical view. I said, look, people just don't care because of Facebook, and there's not enough hours in my life left to talk about, social media, but just know that I'm not the biggest fan. Anyway, I think that that the misconception I had was that people didn't care. Well, I misunderstood their lack of understanding of the point you just made. What's happening with caring? So Apple released, a few months ago, last fall, they released that privacy feature, where you could block third-party applications from asking for data collection. And 96% of iOS users disabled it. People care. They care. They just don't understand. The gap's too big, right? They don't understand how to get from where I am now to a world where I don't do this, because what we've done is, as really smart, oh gosh, we're the guys that are going to fix all your issues for identity and single sign-on access. We've just reduced that friction. We've taken all the friction out. It makes it easier for them to make those decisions. They just want easy, right? And if easy means dissemination of information that maybe they shouldn't, then you're right. It's a big education challenge. So that's why I think this slide, this point is the make or break. Our ability to make this interpretable and understand why it's important is where we gain mass traction and adoption with decentralized technology in general. As long as there is a perception that it's easier for me to do it in another way, we will not succeed. So there's an opportunity here, a massive opportunity for us to really affect some serious change, but it all comes down to our ability to create the solutions that that humans can use and perceive as adding value and adding privacy. I think people care. Well, I know people care now. It's just about our ability to make them understand how to use it. Well, Kilo, that's the last slide I have. What other conversation or points do we have?
So I wanted to get into a quick conversation on what I know as the sort of regulatory guidance that we have available to us to reference for this issue. And then I'm curious if anybody else knows of others that we should put on the radar, and perhaps we can do deep dives into those at future meetings. So the one that I am aware of is called Nist 863. And I've pulled a couple of slides to summarize that quickly. I'm by no means an expert, but I did pull a couple of things that I thought would be important to show. So let me just show those quickly. So the first thing is that they have defined the strength of identity evidence into, this is regulatory language for the US, so it's very dry and not very entertaining to read. But I'm going to skip to the next one, which are really the strong and superior evidence, which are evidence, just to summarize this, it's that it's been cross-referenced and verified with the with a trusted authorization or authentication source, so that not only did you have that evidence, but you've confirmed that it's legitimate, mostly by going back to the issuer of that thing. That might be, for example, if you were looking at a driver's license or a passport, going back to verify through a third party that that stuff is all legitimate and that it checks out. And so I thought that that's interesting, and I'm not sure. Let me just show, there's also some threat mitigation recommendations through Nist to avoid specific things. These are really not that exciting in terms of their creativity in solving these challenges, but they do point out that these are common issues. For example, falsifying documents, using somebody else's documents, which I think is a very interesting challenge, which we've seen a lot of happen in at least in the healthcare institutions. And there are, in Nist, there are 3 levels of assurance. One is really not worth getting into, so I left the details off. 2 is sort of you've done some checking, and 3 is where we're sort of having a conversation about, which is that you include biometrics. You've gone to the superior level of validation against those documents. And so I'm curious if the others on this meeting have are aware of other sort of industry standards around how do you verify that person that we should expose to the group and potentially dive into in more detail at future meetings. Mike, I'm curious, how much does Nist drive some of what you're doing? Are you involved with Nist 863, or is that sort of peripheral to what you guys are pursuing in terms of your solutions?
I think it's not something that we look at and say, oh wow, letter of the law, but it is certainly a strong guide or guidance for everything that we do. All standards are the key to interoperability, right? So if we look at what this has been defined there, it gives us a much easier path to integration or to sales, not in a traditional sense, but really for buy-in, right? We want to try and get buy-in from a larger community. It's much easier to go back and reference and say, look, here are, if Nist defines 3 different security spectrum or whatever those are, we absolutely have to align with those in our solutions and present it. And I think this community is going to have to do some portion of that as well, especially based on the document that you just shared. So I think they're critically important. They're always really hard to conform to. Like I said earlier, it's much faster to just put your head down and go forward blindly and build your solutions in a vacuum. And that's what we have done for years as an industry. And if we truly expect this to be a disruptive factor in our future, we have to start thinking more globally and more standards oriented, and it's very, very difficult to do.
One of the challenges I think that we run into is that we're trying to bring together organizations that don't always talk to each other. Yeah. Because of your focus on trying to bridge systems or bridge across verticals, you end up with some interesting conversations because finance has a slightly different way and different regulations than medical, and the government has a different set of standards that they use for what's acceptable to cross a border. And so you bring medical, air travel, and governments together, and you have 3 different organizations that have not always cooperated directly to identify standards or how we might successfully operate without violating each other's rules.
Right.
Yeah, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say the interoperability is that's the point that Ken just made. That's always the hard. It's always the hard part too, because when you go into a room, and I think this is changing. So understand that it's not all just cynical Mike this morning, although I just came off a road trip, so I am tired. But the problem is when you talk to organizations and you say, okay, we're going to connect, the 3 that Ken just mentioned, we're going to connect air travel, governments, and healthcare. And the natural reaction to that is we think very old school about what that's going to take. Okay, 3 different organizations. That's going to be, each organization is going to have to make 2 separate connections, and so we start thinking about all the work and this, like endpoints, right? So think about endpoints and traditional identity. Well, it used to be, if I have one application, I want to connect that to 20 people, I have to build 40 endpoints, or at least 21, depending on how you do it. But it's a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff, and then guess what? When one of those things changes, you get to redo them all. And isn't that great? And so that's how the world is thinking right now about these federations, for lack of a better descriptor. But the point that Ken was just making there, if we look at it, we say, if we really define the blueprint so that now we have this one common way that we can do that interoperability, and every one of those organizations participating only has to make one connection, now we've really flattened out the world, and it makes it a lot easier for them to get their heads around. It's a hard thing to communicate. And we go through this every day when we're working with enterprise customers, trying to explain the value of the ID ramp, solution and what we're doing. It's the promise of, this all this stuff as it changes and having to redo all this. Very hard because people they're not thinking that way yet, right? So you not only have to explain it, but you have to actually show them, here's what it means, this is how it works. And that's going to be the toughest thing here. But once they get it, right, once the light bulb clicks, then it's downhill, right? Because then they understand. And that's the big value here, is if we can set this up, put this blueprint out and say, this is the way it needs to work. And the value of doing this is faster adoption, more security, easier to, that bridge. We're not talking about a really old school physical, okay, the airlines has to get out a whole new set of tools and build this interface into healthcare. And we're providing this fabric, if you will, out here in front that will allow that interoperability in a safe and secure way. I think that's where we really win. It is a little bit tougher message to try and convey, but once, like I said, once people get it, then I always say this in the identity space. The first time you use a verifiable credential to log into a service, and you didn't issue that credential, the light bulb happens, right? You're like, wait a minute, I don't have to issue this thing anymore, right? All I have to do is ask you for something I know you have, and it's incredibly transformative, and it changes your thinking. And you'll be forever changed in how you look at the world and some of these things. So I think that's a big opportunity this project has, is to really help with the mind share and the market and the industry of how these interoperabilities and how these alliances can be built. And so that's why I'm so excited to just be part of it and see how it evolves.
Well, we're happy to have you. I think the other thing, just to get into the weeds a little bit further, is that we have to talk about what are the minimums, because each use case, and Bill, I see your comment in the chat about looking at each market and doing your research about that, but it's not necessarily one answer, because you maybe it's one answer to verify the identity of an individual, but you then might need additional things. So for example, one of my experiences in, I'm always the guinea pig for testing technology. And so I was vaccinated in the state of New York, and the state of New York issued they have an Excelsior Pass, which is not totally decentralized, but is a good first step. They ask several questions while onboarding you onto that app that they then use to verify you. So they ask you things that you, if you were that person, should know, like what was the date of your first vaccination? What county, this is New York, so what county were you vaccinated in? And so then they're able to use that without going through some other steps, which is they're sort of bypassing identity right now, to be able to release that data to you. But those also serve a purpose, right? If we're trying to get to the identity of person and then get to their health record, is there additional stuff? How many people named, I'm not the best example, Keela Shatskin, are there out there that could potentially be this person, and how are we going to be able to whittle down that record in the less verified data warehouses that we have to mine to? So I think another discussion point is to try to get to those minimums and what are the recommended data collection elements that we need to tackle this challenge.
I think you're spot on. I think that's the challenge, is if you're not going down the path of biometrics, then you do have a minimum standard requirement for the issuer to validate it. I mean, that's really what you're trying to identify. And I think you see that across the board. Each business case will be different. Each individual have a different strategy around that governance of validating the data. So I think that's the challenge and that's when you get to a healthcare Rio, or even maybe it's just a small practice that they want to validate each user, but you don't want to get to the same point of where we're at is, what's your favorite color? What was the first high school you went to? What was, the traditional, that goes back 10 years ago, of the strategy. And And I like what Mike's saying, we've got to jump to the next level. What makes that standard? Where are we? And maybe we can define that here with this group, because it gets back to our healthcare. I mean, that's what we're really focused on, is trying to give access to each individual, but yet taking the taking the storage capability of all of the data that is in our healthcare, taking that away from the Apples, the Googles, and things like that. I don't want them to have my data. I don't want an Apple Watch. I don't want them to know what my heart rate is today, because then they're going to start throwing it to my insurance agency and then saying, hey, now you can charge Mr. Bill another $100 because his heart rate's up. I don't want that.
Or selling it for research, which is really what they're
selling
doing.
it for research. That's exactly right. That's more the case.
Yes. Well, it's very interesting, and I think we have to, and maybe this is our sort of next level conversation on this particular topic, is that we can bring in sort of the world of healthcare data release today. Is you go to the hospital or healthcare facility and say, I would like you to send my records to so and so, and they check that you sign a release and they verify that you are you, and they do that all in person. I mean, we're talking paper solutions. So Ken also pointed out, right, we're in an ecosystem where we're on all sorts of different phases, and we need to be able to transition and coexist. And so I think the other thing is considering, what are those healthcare institutions comfortable with today? What do they do on paper? And how can we say, look, we're doing at a minimum that, maybe even more over here, and this really is okay, let's proceed.
It's good. Maybe it's like, say, next discussion, we get somebody that's willing to sit and talk with us all here as well.
Yeah, excellent. Is there anyone that has another thought on where this discussion should go from here? We've raised so many more questions than answers, and so certainly we'll need to bring this back to dig into it a little bit more.
Keela, I'd love a discussion on how we handle verification methods and the secret sauce that we got to in the first couple minutes of the meeting, on how we're going to authenticate that stuff, but support it in a way that is as open as possible, and certainly open to new entrants into the space. I think that there's some opportunities that we have with protocols to be able to allow for potentially proprietary methods of validation, but do it in a way that encourages the development of new technology instead of mandating use of the current ones, and certainly not mandating the use of any specific proprietary technologies. There's a balance there that I think we can tread, and that would be, I think, a really interesting discussion.
Excellent.
So
If you
Sam,
have any ideas on that, Sam, I'm happy. We can have an offline conversation to prep for a future agenda. Sorry,
Sam,
Ken.
I think that there's also a consideration, a balance to allow for how do proprietary solutions fit into an ecosystem. What is their role? Because that's where some of the innovation occurs to develop and create new types of technologies. How do they play into the system and do it in a way that doesn't create lock-in or allow or remove portability of things, so that if I say I want to change my biometrics from vendor A to vendor B, how does that occur? And because we need to recognize that it's going to be some kind of a blend of open technologies and open standards and things that are also proprietary. How do they fit in? That's I think a good extension of your discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can talk offline about how to organize that morass.
Excellent. Okay, if there are no other questions, I appreciate everybody's participation today. And Mike, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to get us thinking.
My pleasure. I wish I could have done more in the way of providing answers, but these are some of the questions that we need to be asking. I really like Sam's point where he was going with that. That would be a great topic. So I hope we can figure something out for the next one.
Absolutely. Okay. So I think with that, we will be in touch soon. And Ken, do we have next week locked in yet?
I think we're planning to go over the mobile verifier app and or possibly the other enterprise app. So we're trying to alternate between technical deep dives and higher level discussions. And so next one's a technical deep dive. And those are the two potential topics.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Good to see you.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff.
Stop the recording so we can